From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
President Biden says Congress should immediately return to Washington to pass emergency funding in the aftermath of Hurricanes Milton and Helene.
We'll have more on the devastating toll of the storms this hour with Florida Congresswoman Wasserman Schultz and former FEMA Administrator Brock Long.
And Eric Van Nostrand, chief economist for the Treasury Department, will join us later as consumer inflation data comes in hot. And Donald Trump floats new economic proposals in Detroit, including making car loan interest fully tax deductible. Thanks for joining us on the Thursday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Earlier today, President Biden sharing updates on the damage from Hurricane Milton and had this to say about whether emergency aid in response to the dual hurricanes is on the way. Take a listen.
The SBA is pretty right at the edge right now. And I think the Congress should be coming back and moving on the emergency needs immediately. And they're going to have to come back after the election as well, because this is going to be a long haul for total rebuilding. There's going to be a need for significant amounts of money. We're already underway of trying to calculate what the costs will be, because we don't want to mislead anybody. We want to make sure all the costs are able to be covered.
Joining us now with more Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari with his eyes on the storm response here. And Jonathan, a lot of that is going to have to come from Congress, where you do your work every day. And we're hearing calls from both sides of the aisle now, including the president, to come back to Washington and do something that's not what we're hearing from the speaker, though, is it?
Yeah, we're not hearing that from leadership. I think there's a reluctance on the part of Speaker Mike Johnson to bring people off the campaign trail and also to bring up a bill that might not necessarily have full support from the House conference. We've seen Republicans in the past object to emergency storm aid, and it might only take a few people to oppose it that it could suddenly become an issue in this campaign. Remember, both chambers passed some storm aid when they left in the financial spending package right before they left town in September. So I think there's a sense among lawmakers that there is money available for the short term.
Well, so in the longer term, they're going to have to sort out these supplemental funding requests. They'll also have to sort out, as we know, taxes in 2025 when the 2017 tax cuts expire. And it seems we're getting new tax ideas each and every day from Donald Trump, including this, which he announced at the Economic Club of Detroit earlier today.
Today, I am also announcing that as part of our tax cuts, we will make interest on car loans fully deductible. This will stimulate massive domestic auto production and make car ownership dramatically more affordable for millions and millions of working American families.
Clearly targeting a very specific audience there in Detroit, Jonathan, but you layer on Social Security not being taxed, tips, et cetera, et cetera. What is the likelihood that any of this gets through Congress ultimately, even if he wins the presidency? Yeah, I mean, it's all going to depend. All his proposals, all of Kamala Harris's proposals, they're all going to depend on what shakes out in these Senate and House races and who has the power in which chamber. This one could face trouble even if Republicans control both chambers. I think, there are certain Republicans who I think are going to be conscious of the price tag of all these things. We're already looking at, before this proposal, something in the neighborhood of $15 trillion to extend a lot of the taxes that are already in existence. And if Democrats control it, I could see a lot of opposition to this, especially when you consider, someone who's driving a Mercedes-Benz might get a tax break on their interest. I think a lot of Democrats would have a problem with that. All right, Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari, thank you so much for joining us. Now, September consumer price inflation data came in hot today, rising 2.4% year on year. So for more on this, joining us now is Bloomberg's Kate Davison. So, Kate, there's kind of two ways you could look at this. On the one hand, yes, higher than expected. On the other hand, this is the lowest inflation reading we've got since the second month of Biden's term. So pick your poison.
Yeah, it was kind of a mixed report. I think that was probably fair to say. I think that what we saw was the reaction to it was this was hotter than economists expected, right? We have seen inflation kind of resume its downward trend after a little bit of a scare at the beginning of the year, right? It seemed like inflation was reaccelerating, kind of freaked everyone out. know, kind of freaked out markets, freaked out the Fed. And it's been comforting that the past few months over the summer, there had been this downward trend. This sort of disrupted that for sure. We've seen now 2 months in a row of monthly core inflation at 0.3%, a little bit higher than was expected. I think for Fed officials, though, they're probably taking this with a grain of salt. At least that's what we heard them saying today. They sort of shrugged off the numbers.
When you add it to the jobs report last week, though, the markets certainly think there's a reason to maybe change the view on what the Fed does the rest of this year. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. The Fed officials, they have to provide their forecast for the rest of the year, which we got in September. And so they signaled that what's probably pretty likely, and Jay Powell confirmed this when he spoke not so long ago, that there would likely be a couple of quarter percentage point cuts. So there's 2 more meetings. So that would mean one smaller cut at each meeting. They went for the big one to kick things off. But I think that what this makes pretty clear, is that it's going to be hard. It's hard to see another big 50 basis point rate cut. There was the possibility floated by Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic today. Maybe they could skip a meeting even. So there's obviously different views among the Fed officials on where this could be headed.
Still data dependent with Bloomberg's Kate Davidson. Thank you so much, Kate, for being with us. Coming up, Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida on the damage assessment, the cleanup, and what happens next following the destruction of Hurricane Milton. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The storm was significant, but thankfully this was not the worst case scenario. The storm did weaken before landfall, and the storm surge, as initially reported, has not been as significant overall as what was observed for Hurricane Helene.
It's Florida Governor Ron DeSantis giving an update earlier on the damage left by Hurricane Milton, the second hurricane in 2 weeks. Joining us now is Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us this day after the storm landed in Florida here. It's part of the narrative today, and it's in part by what we heard from the governor himself, that a bullet seemed to have been dodged here when it at least comes to the Tampa Bay area, that Florida avoided a worst case scenario. But of course, I know you're still dealing with massive flooding and a lot of other danger that's been left behind by the storm. More than 3 million people have no power. So let's start by asking what Florida needs right now.
Well, I think, Joe, we have to be careful about how we characterize the blow that Florida experienced. I would say it was more like Florida dodged a cannonball rather than a bullet, because we did just feel a massive impact with Hurricane Helene, and we have people who are reeling from that storm. The storm surge from Helene was massive and hit places that even more significantly than was expected. So between Helene and the 3 million without power, the effects that, even though Milton actually hit from the west, from the Gulf Coast, there were very significant effects, including in St. Lucie County on the east side of Florida. There were about 12 tornadoes that touched down, and we had deaths in St. Lucie County. So this was a very dangerous storm, and we are going to have very serious impact in the aftermath.
Well, including potentially what could be tens of billions of dollars in damages, in recovery costs that could be needed here. Your Republican colleague in Florida, Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, posted on X today that she spoke by phone with President Biden. And in part, what she said is, if Congress goes into special session, we can get it passed immediately, meaning more aid for FEMA for hurricane victims. She says this needs to happen. Speaker Johnson, call us back. She subsequently said that she did speak with the House Speaker. Congresswoman, what are you hearing from your own leadership, and whether or not it is likely you will be returning to Washington prior to the now scheduled date of November 12th?
Well, it would have been helpful if Congresswoman Luna had actually voted for the CR that included the disaster relief that we added, but that the Republicans refused to add enough of. And that's why SBA, in terms of their disaster loan program, is getting perilously low. And while FEMA has the resources that they need now to respond, This is something that we should have addressed and that Democrats have urged the Republican leadership to address, and they refused. So right now, we need to make sure that in the 72 hours after Milton has hit and it has departed, we have to make sure that people are really careful about trying to get back to their homes. They need to heed the warnings and communicate with local officials, because this is where we have a lot of deaths occur when the storm has departed. So, and what I heard from local folks on the West Coast was that they're actually still in search and rescue mode for a lot of people who had flooding, and so we need a way to beat before we're focused on recovery. But thankfully, FEMA pre-positioned 1,200 employees across the state to make sure that they're ready to follow up on that recovery. And we do need to return to Washington. We need to make sure that we have the kind of funding necessary, because actually the disaster fund spent half of what we put in it in the CR in the first 8 days of the fiscal year. That's why I wish that my Republican colleagues had actually heeded the urging to make sure that we put that replenishment in before we left town.
Congresswoman, I spoke with one of your colleagues earlier today on the early edition of Balance of Power, Democratic Congresswoman Kathy Castor of Florida, whose district includes part of the Tampa Bay area. She joined us by phone because she has no power. Here's what she had to say about the long-term economic impact on Florida.
The long-term economic harm to our way of life in Florida also is going to be critical. We're already suffering a property insurance crisis. We pay the highest rates by far than any place across the country. Electric bills have been out of sight, and this is the new abnormal, I'm afraid, because of extreme hot temperatures.
Congresswoman, we understand that FEMA has enough money for now for individual assistance, but it's in fact the SBA, the Small Business Association Administration, I should say, that is now down to 2 weeks worth of funding. Is that the first matter that Congress will have to deal with here?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the SBA disaster loan program is getting perilously low, and we're going to need to deal with that as soon as we come back. If the Speaker is unwilling to bring us back before that, what we really need to make sure we do, Joe, over the long term, is Congress really needs to pass a comprehensive program that ensures that we have the kind of reinsurance available to mitigate against these disasters and not have the bottom drop out of property insurance when these disasters strike. The state legislature and Ron DeSantis have not done enough to actually reform property insurance here in Florida. But really, we have natural disasters all over the country, and we need to make sure that we have the kind of reform that covers the country that can provide that kind of necessary mitigation, or we're going to have a real crisis on our hands. We really already have a crisis here in Florida in terms of affordability.
Well, certainly. And Congresswoman, before we let you go, obviously this is coming with just weeks to go until Election Day. Are you concerned that in Florida and in the other states that were affected by Hurricane Helene, that there will be serious disruption to people's ability to cast their ballot?
You know, we have dealt with, because hurricane season occurs in and overlaps with the election time, we have dealt with, and our supervisors of elections are pretty experienced in standing up alternative sites when that's necessary, and they prepare for that in advance. But we need to make sure that that happens. I really wish that Ron DeSantis had agreed to extend the voter registration deadline that was Monday, as people were preparing for Milton and still reeling in the aftermath of Helene, but he refused to do that, unfortunately. But we do need to make sure our supervisors of elections are looking at alternative sites if the sites for early voting, and early voting starts a week from Monday, are unavailable. And so that is a concern, but usually we're in pretty good shape in terms of preparing for people to have an opportunity to have a place to go to vote. But obviously, people who are dealing with the devastation in the aftermath of a storm, whether they cast a vote ends up being, unfortunately, a lower priority. So that's going to be a challenge.
All right, Congresswoman, we really appreciate your time this evening. We wish you and the people of Florida well. That is Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida. Thank you so much. Now, coming up, we'll have more on what's next for rescue and recovery in the aftermath of both Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene. Former FEMA Administrator Brock Long is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Today, FEMA is joining the state to begin damage assessments to ensure Floridians have what they need. To reiterate President Biden's message yesterday, every available resource is being deployed as fast as possible to impacted communities, and we will not leave until the work is done.
That was Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas earlier today, talking about the resources that are being sent to Florida in the wake of Hurricane Milton and, of course, the aftermath as well of Hurricane Helene. Joining us now for more on that here on Bloomberg TV and radio is Brock Long. He is former FEMA Administrator, joining us from North Carolina. Sir, thank you for being here. Obviously, Florida is one thing. What happened in western North Carolina and other parts of the southeast and after Helene is another thing entirely. Can we just begin with what you are seeing in North Carolina, what you have seen, and what you think is realistic in terms of timeline and cost here for recovery?
Sure. So the mission is shifting from search and rescue ultimately to life sustainment missions, trying to help people understand how to obtain safe, sanitary, functional place to be, get them out of the shelters, and then a more suitable situation for them to restart their lives. And in addition to that, the initial recovery, long-term recovery, conversations are also starting to begin with many of our communities. I was up actually in Boone, North Carolina, Watauga County today, and SBA, Francisco Sanchez, the Associate Administrator of SBA, was there talking about the economic recovery and the help that can come to local businesses. And so this recovery is going to be a massive hit. It's going to be a long time, and it was a massive economic hit to Western North Carolina because right now is peak season. The leaves are changing. It's supposed to be a beautiful fall. You've got ski season coming up. And the communities have just been wiped out and devastated, and help's going to be needed for a long time, well after the cameras are gone.
Well, when we hear that the SBA is down to 2 weeks of funding, it certainly underscores the urgency of what you're talking about with small businesses trying to get back on their feet. There's also the matter of an election that's underway right now. Of course, Brock, North Carolina's Elections Board unanimously approving emergency measures this week for the 13 western counties in North Carolina that were impacted here. It allows them to change hours and even move polling locations to different areas, consolidate them if need be. How necessary will be those measures in the coming days?
Oh, well, I mean, people have the right to vote, and I think it's the local, state, and federal government's job to make sure that anybody can get out and vote. And it's difficult. They're going to have to look at alternative locations and people voting out of their precincts, possibly if the location that they typically use is gone. But the most important thing, this cycle that we're in with disaster supplemental funding has got to end. I went through it when I was FEMA Administrator in 2017 to 19. I had to ask Congress 3 times for more funding into the Disaster Relief Fund. And eventually it was approved. But how do we get out of this cycle? And right now, I believe it's not just the funding, but how do we get out of this response cycle? And where do we start to incentivize communities to do the right things, such as proper land use planning, implementing the stronger building codes that the ICC recommends, and properly insuring your infrastructure? And until Congress starts to incentivize these communities to do that, we're going to be stuck in this response cycle for many years to come.
Yeah, adaptation and mitigation are certainly things to consider here, sir, but even to do that will require the investment of resources. So is it that when Congress is considering funding for emergencies, that part of that needs to be not just a response when they happen, but acting preemptively when they do so, allowing states in these areas that are often affected by storms such as these to be making those investments that they might not be able to afford on their own?
Yeah, the problem is the majority of the until I was in office and got the until the Disaster Recovery Reform Act was passed and we created the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, it really put mitigation in the forefront, because if we can mitigate and reduce the impacts on the back end, that's the optimal thing. The other thing is that FEMA will also fund large-scale post-disaster mitigation recovery efforts. So, North Carolina and Florida are both enhanced mitigation states. So 20% of the estimated public assistance dollars that FEMA is going to put out to these communities to fix infrastructure, public contents, public buildings and replacing contents, 20% of whatever that total bill is going to become available to these states to do, innovative mitigation work. Like, there is no reason these communities should continue to struggle if we can get the mitigation money and use it correctly and rebuild the infrastructure to a new standard to handle the hazards that these communities are faced with.
Well, that's really important, Brock, and so is the story of misinformation that has surrounded the response to the storm, especially where you are right now in North Carolina. We've heard stories, in fact, so many rumors going around that people skeptical of FEMA are rejecting help and services from FEMA officials who are on the ground. Can you tell us, since you're actually there, what you're seeing, how bad this situation might be?
Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how the system works. Disaster response and recovery is a team sport. It starts with neighbor helping neighbor all the way to the federal government. Disasters are locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. FEMA was never designed to be a 911 agency. And actually, when you look at the size of FEMA, it's one of the smaller government agencies that exist. If Homeland Security has over 300,000 employees, FEMA only has 21,000 of those employees. So Congress needs to not only fix the budgeting cycles, but they also need to right-size the agency. But also, how do we build capability in emergency management at the local and state level? It's not just, FEMA. The other thing that people don't understand is that a lot of the infrastructure that we depend on to make life work in our communities, FEMA has no ownership over this. We don't own the power grids. We don't own the communications backbones. And so there does need to be innovative conversations about mitigating both public and private sector infrastructure, which we call community lifelines. These are the things that have to be working in a community that if they're not working, people are dying or life routine is disrupted.
Brock, we have 30 seconds left, but what would you say to people propagating misinformation about the emergency response to these storms?
Stop politicizing FEMA. They politicized FEMA when I was head of it constantly. There was never a call for stopping the criticism or anything like that. We've got to stop politicizing FEMA. There are 21,000 people who are dedicated to helping other people. They spend months, if not years, away from their families over their careers, trying to help people on their worst day. Yeah.
Really appreciate it, Brock. Stay safe where you are. Brock Long joining us from North Carolina. He's the former administrator of FEMA. Coming up, a look at today's CPI data with Eric Van Nostrand, chief economist for the U.S. Treasury Department. He'll join us live next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think what's continued to be really important is the labor market. I think inflation is still last year's story. Yes, there was an upside surprise there, but at the end of the day, it's about labor, labor, and labor.
Greg Peters, the co-CIO of PGIM Fixed Income, reacting to today's hotter inflation and softer jobless claims data on Bloomberg earlier. For more on the state of the economy, joining us now here on Balance of Power is Eric Van Nostrand, chief economist for the U.S. Treasury Department, joining us from New York. Eric, when you look at the data collectively, including the payroll figure from last week, which was obviously much stronger than anticipated, what is it this economy is in need of, or can it continue on this path, status quo, for some time?
Well, I think what today's report shows us, Kaylee, is that on the inflation side, we've got one more data point showing that this economy is well on its way to a soft landing. The strong employment report last week, which illustrated that unemployment remains near historic lows. The U.S. economy continues to add jobs at a very robust clip. The combination of that strong growth and soft employment is a combination that no one really thought possible a couple years ago. And it emphasizes that this economy is firing on all cylinders with strong consumer spending, strong business investment, all while inflation comes down. At the same time, we recognize we still have work to do to keep costs low for American families. And the administration's agenda, President Biden and Vice President Harris are focused on an agenda to keep lowering costs, to keep that slowing down that rate of inflation. And we're looking at that across housing, across energy, across prescription drugs. It's really an important focus as we head into the next phase of the U.S. recovery.
Well, Eric, this is the last CPI report, the final CPI before the election. It is also, incidentally, the final CPI before the next Fed meeting, which starts the very day later. You said that it looks like we're on the way, or it reinforces that we're on the way to a soft landing. How would you describe the state of this economy now as people are voting?
With unemployment near historic lows, at the same time that the inflation rate today returned to its pre-pandemic level of about 2.4% a year, which is where it was right before the pandemic began. The fact that we're at that level with unemployment so low is exactly the sort of combination that, frankly, Joe, most economic forecasters over the past couple of years said was impossible. But the administration was committed to expanding supply, to lowering cost for Americans, and that combination is one that really sets us up well for continued labor market growth as costs continue to come down.
Well, of course, one part of this administration, the vice president, is currently running to be president against Donald Trump. Sir, and earlier today on Bloomberg TV, economist Nouriel Roubini spoke about his economic predictions no matter who becomes president. This is what he told us, and we'll have you respond.
I worry that regardless of Harris or Trump, that over the medium term, we have a number of negative aggregate supply shocks that are meaningful. Deglobalization, reshoring, friendshoring, aging, restriction of migration, geopolitical conflict, climate change, pandemics, backlash against the liberal democracy. All these things tend to increase cost of production, reduce growth, and there are stagflation over the medium term. So some of my arguments are independent of whether Harris or Trump will be elected.
I wonder, Eric, what you make of that. For everything you just said on the efforts of this administration, global factors are what they are. Does he have a point?
Well, what I'd say to Dr. Roubini is to look at the results that have materialized over the past couple years. In the pandemic, we saw considerable aggregate supply shocks of the sort that he mentioned. But what's happened since then is unemployment has shifted to a very low historical level at the same time that inflation has slowed by more than 2/3 from its peak. And that's not what you see when supply is shrinking. That's what you see when supply is expanding, when the American economy is growing its capacity to make stuff, to build in clean manufacturing and in semiconductors. And those are the results we're really seeing. Of course, there's more work to do, and of course, there are important challenges on the supply side that this country faces. And that's why President Biden and Vice President Harris are both focused on an agenda to lower costs, boosting supply in the energy sector on both the traditional and clean energy front, boosting supply in the housing sector, recognizing that we need to expand the supply of housing to lower costs for Americans, and ensuring that seniors don't have to pay more for their prescription drugs. That combination of a supply side focus while making the investments we need to expand clean manufacturing in this country, that's exactly the way that we address some of those long-term challenges that Dr. Roubini cited.
Eric, what do you do with the wild card that is energy right now, though? We've got Texas crude back above $75 a barrel. A lot of that has to do with concerns about something very unpredictable, what's happening in the Middle East. Where are we going to be as we enter the winter heating season this year?
Well, on the Middle East, Joe, let me say our focus first is obviously on the human suffering in Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, elsewhere in the region. But as we think about managing the economic spillovers, one thing the Biden administration has been focused on over the past couple years is, again, ensuring that our supply of energy produced domestically, both in the traditional front in the oil and gas sector, but also on the clean energy front, continues to grow. And today we're the biggest oil producer in the world. We're the biggest exporter of natural gas in the world, all while we continue to make record-breaking investments in clean energy. And adding that energy supply is the best insurance policy we can get to keep energy costs low for American families. In the face of challenging geopolitical shocks, managing that supply is the strategy that, just like we saw in the labor market, can promote continued growth without putting inflationary pressure on American families.
Eric, before we let you go, we also want to ask you about some news we got today. The Treasury, together with the DOJ, with the second highest penalty for a bank ever for money laundering, TD Bank. How exactly did this come together, and how are you monitoring this kind of activity moving forward?
Well, the Treasury Department's focus broadly on ensuring financial stability, on keeping costs low for Americans, really involves both thinking about those macroeconomic elements of supply and demand that we addressed, but also ensuring that financial crime is managed and that the threats of money laundering are managed appropriately on a global scale. And we spend a lot of time at the intersection of our foreign policy goals and our economic goals. And I think, as you heard from the Attorney General and Deputy Secretary Adeyemo today, the action that we took against TD is focused on ensuring that continued financial stability and ensuring that our financial sector is complying with the important sanctions and with the important guidelines for managing illicit finance that we have put in place globally.
Eric, it's great to have you. Thank you for the conversation. Eric Van Nostrand, Chief Economist for the Treasury Department. Good to have you with us here on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll look more closely at the fallout, the damage, and political impact of our second hurricane in 2 weeks, this time Milton, scraping across Florida. And our political panel joins next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
Are you kidding me? Mr. President Trump, former President Trump, get a life, man. Help these people.
Will you hold him accountable? You said you were going to hold Booth accountable.
Public will hold him accountable. And you better than the press hold him accountable because you know the truth.
Do you plan to speak with former President Trump?
No.
President Biden earlier this afternoon answering a question of whether or not he's spoken to Donald Trump in the midst of Hurricane Milton, knowing that this story of misinformation has been growing quite loud. Yesterday, Joe Biden was fact-checking Donald Trump from the podium when it came to the response to Hurricane Helene. With us now, this evening's political panel, Aisha Mills, Democratic strategist, John Seaton, founder, CEO of Echo Canyon Consulting, Republican strategist. It's great to have you both here. Thank you so much. John, I'll start with you and your view here of what's happened over the past couple of days when it comes to some of the wild rumors that have spawned in part from the Trump campaign. Unprecedented to see the President of the United States fact-checking someone who he's actually not running against in this case from the White House. Is that enough to set the record straight?
Well, I think it's going to take all of us to make sure that the people who are in need of help get the help that they need, and I think that President Biden has been very clear on that point. I also think that, frankly, Governor DeSantis has done a very good job saying that he is coordinating well with the White House, with the agencies on the ground, and I think that it's going to take kind of constant communication to make sure that it cuts through the noise in social media, get the facts to the people who need to get help on the ground.
Well, of course, what makes this more potent, perhaps, Aisha, is that it's happening in tandem with the final stretch here of an election cycle. When we think about the politicization of this, sure, Joe Biden, the president of the United States, has an interest in getting factual information to the people who need it. But is this not going to potentially be perceived as an attack against Donald Trump, something that could blow back among those who might be more sympathetic to his cause?
Mm-hmm. Well, here's the thing is that what is most unprecedented is that we are literally in the middle of crisis right now. There are natural disasters, plural, which over the last couple of weeks have put people in harm's way, have destroyed people's homes, have people literally now leaving and migrants from their own communities who some folks, unfortunately, have actually succumbed to and died because of the consequences of these storms. And what is so unprecedented that you have someone who is a former sitting president of the United States, who is now running to be the president of the United States again, that is literally pushing propaganda and lies and attempting to dismantle what little bit of trust and faith and belief that Americans still have left in their government, and is putting people in harm's way as a way to try to advance his own cause of suggesting that government is somehow bad and failing. Now, I always wonder, if government is so bad and such a failure, why on earth are you running to lead it? That is something that we should really think about. I don't really know that there is at this point, literally, 20-something days from the election, the threat of a blowback from people who support Trump, because people who support either camp are going to show up and vote for either candidate that is currently running for president. We're not in a swing dynamic right now. I think what we're going to see is how this moment, how this crisis and the way that the candidates are responding, and certainly how the president is responding, ultimately gets people who might not have thought that they felt like voting animated and recognizing that it's important that they do show up and cast their ballot. So this is going to, I think, motivate more people rather than amp up the other side.
Yeah. You said something important, John, and that's the way the governor has been handling this. Ron DeSantis, you've worked in a lot of different levels of government when it comes to state and local government that can, frankly, have a more credible tone with constituents than what's coming from Washington. Is that the answer here? Get as local as you can when it comes to welcoming FEMA or working with FEMA in these communities?
Absolutely. My first job in politics was an intern in the Denver mayor's office for Wellington Webb, and it was always striking to me the connection that he had with folks on the ground, everyday citizens. It's a very personal relationship, and as you have local electeds, if you have state elected officials, they just have much more, hands-on experience speaking with people, having those relationships. And so I think the extent to which that Governor DeSantis is able to communicate with folks, people who are in the evacuation zones, get away, keep yourself safe. People are going to listen, and I think that he's gotten very, very high marks for his response.
You mentioned Denver, brings me to the state of Colorado, somewhere Donald Trump is going to be tomorrow. He's visiting Aurora, a town that he says has been overtaken by Venezuelan gang members who have migrated to the United States. I understand this rally is potentially sold out. What do you make of this move, knowing that the town of Aurora, city of Aurora? Aurora does not want him there, is my point.
Sure. Well, I mean, he's the Republican nominee for president, and he's going to go campaign where he thinks it's most beneficial to his campaign. And even if Colorado may not be in play or may not be as close as some of the other swing states, a couple things at play here. First of all, it really shines a light on an issue that's very, very important to his campaign, which is the immigration crisis and the crisis at the border. So this will really kind of nationalize that issue for him. And second of all, there's at least one very, very closely contested congressional race, Colorado 8, which is going to be very, very close. The extent to which he can be on the ground in Colorado, try to galvanize his supporters to not just vote for him, but also vote Republican down the ticket, I think, in his view, will help the Republican nominee.
So there might be other motivations to do this, but Aisha, this bumps up against the same story of misinformation that we're talking about here, whether it's Aurora or Springfield, Ohio, or whatever is happening in the mountains of North Carolina, isn't it?
Well, one of the things I do believe will backfire on Election Day is the fact that it is the Trump campaign, and singularly the Trump campaign, that is concerned about so-called violent migrants who are apparently coming in, as he's lied and said, in droves and harming people. That's actually not a fact, and it's not real life for the vast majority of the American public. It is and J.D. Vance, in fact, his running mate, admitted that it is a narrative that they have made up out of whole cloth in order to advance their own agenda and their own campaign ideals. And all that does is it stokes a base who already believes the lies. But the reason that Aurora doesn't want to see him coming, and most other towns and cities in America don't want to see the Trump campaign coming, is not only because he gets there and he lies about the very people who are there on the ground, the people who are residents, the folks who've lived there for many years, and the consequences of that are deadly in some instances. The other piece of it is that Donald Trump does not pay his bills. He doesn't pay his bills. So there are several jurisdictions and towns who say that when he shows up and he does these rallies and he rakes up all of these, the expenses around local law enforcement needing to protect and safeguard him and being able to have that public space to do what he's intending to do, he then walks away, leaving it in shambles. So he does more harm when his campaign shows up than he does good.
All right, Aisha Mills and John Seaton, our political panel, are going to be sticking with us as we look now down the ballot with new polls out in a few key Senate races. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
She's still in denial about the 2022 election. And now I give you 1 minute. You have 1 minute. Will you finally tell the people of Arizona Did you win or lose that election?
Can I talk about water really quickly? Because
I'm going to give you 30
we
seconds to respond, and please talk about water. 30
we can
seconds,
also talk
please.
about water separately?
We're running out of time, so
okay,
30 seconds.
Let's talk about water.
That was part of last night's Arizona Senate debate between Ruben Gallego and Kari Lake. It's one of the races that we're keeping a close eye on for November. Back with us now is our political panel, Aisha Mills and John Seaton. So, John, obviously you are very familiar with Arizona politics. I wonder if you believe that debate moved the needle at all in this race last night, and where exactly you think it stands. How tight is it?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it moved the needle. I actually think both candidates did what they came there to do. Kari Lake got to spend quite a bit of time talking about the crisis at the border, talking about immigration. It's a huge issue to her. It's a very big issue for Arizona voters, and she spent quite a bit of time talking about that. Congressman Gallego clearly wanted to get that one question in. He did what he set out to do. So I'm not sure that it moves the needle a ton. I think it's a very, very close race. I think it's closer, actually, than the public polls are currently showing. I think that Gallego got off to a head start, had a lot more money, was able to tell his story, introduce himself to Arizona voters, and it's a very compelling story. So I think he's done a very good job in doing that. Having said that, it's still a very closely divided state. Republicans have actually slightly gained in voter registration since 2020, so in 2022. So I expect the race to be close. I'd say Gallego has a slight edge right now, but it's well within the margin of error.
Another one that's too close to call. Aisha, that was his moment, I guess, last night. Kind of like Tim Walz had his moment in the vice presidential debate. Is that the question when it comes to 2020, when it comes to election denials, that moves independent voters?
Look, I'm still one of those people who I really don't believe that the movable middle is that wide. I think it's a narrative that is a little bit antiquated, that we've been saying for decades and decades in American politics. There's been a suggestion that there's this big group of people that one can move. I think what it is about who's going to be moved to the polls and who's not. Folks know what their values are. They know what they believe. And by the way, the vast majority of Arizonans believe that there should be a right to abortion, which is also on the ballot in Arizona and going to be a really pivotal aspect of the election. And so I think that, you know, what we're seeing here is that Ruben Gallego actually, the things that I've seen, is doing very well and has a lead larger than the lead that Vice President Harris has nationally in the polls against Donald Trump. It's beyond margin of error. It's a tough state, but it does look like he's connecting with voters there and certainly reflects the values of more of the people in that state than otherwise.
Well, let's talk about some other states that could help decide the balance of the Senate. New polling from New York Times and Siena shows Republicans leading, Aisha, in Montana, Texas, and Florida. The map's not looking good for your party. What do you think when you see that data? Let's be really clear. The Democrats have never won Montana, Texas, and Florida. That's a little bit of a misrepresentation of the path to 270 for the Democratic candidate to win. Now, Michigan and Wisconsin. But for the balance of the Senate? For the balance of the Senate, those are also states that, by the way, Democrats have not won. And so here's where we are in terms of the balance of power. Well, those are difficult. John Tester is the incumbent Democrat in this case, though. Those are difficult states for us to move through as Democrats. But here's the thing, is that I think that, you know, the real challenge that's being faced right now is that those electorates have not shifted for the Democrats in a significantly meaningful way, even though in Texas and Florida, as two great examples, there has been more money spent there over the last, I would say, 2 cycles in terms of the Senate race, but also in terms of the presidential races. Those states are really difficult and interesting to move through. I think that, you know, what's going to happen there is that Tester is probably going to hold on. I don't know that the Democrats are going to be able to pick up in Texas or in Florida because just historically that balance there isn't really kind of the game of the balance of power that we like to think it is. And when we watch this cycle after cycle after cycle.
John, I want to hear from you on some of these important Senate races because the New York Times is making the case this morning that the GOP is on track to flipping the Senate. You look at states we've already mentioned like Ohio, Montana. Yeah. Looks like Democrats might be turning away from Texas and Florida. Where are you? It was always going to be a very good map for Republicans and a very challenging map for Democrats this cycle. If you just look at where the battleground is, right away, West Virginia kind of came off the map when Senator Manchin announced that he wasn't going to run for re-election, bring it basically a 50-50 Senate, and then Republicans almost had a menu of options to choose from, right, when it came to which was the one seat they were going to pick up. There's Montana, there's Ohio, there's
tougher races, but still possible wins in Michigan and in Wisconsin. And it leaves the Democrats to try to pick up a seat in Texas and Florida, which, as my colleague noted, are very challenging states.
There's a Maryland debate tonight. Are you taking that seriously?
I think Larry Hogan is probably the best shot the Republicans had, but it's still a very, very challenging state for Republican to win, especially at the federal level.
Great panel. John Seaton, Aisha Mills, great conversation to both of you. Thank you for the insights. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You know the drill. You can find it on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow. It'll be Friday. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.